Hello. In this video, I will be talking about leadership skills. In other words, I will try to answer the question, what are some of those skills that you need to have, that you need to develop for you to be effective in roles of leadership? This is going to be a two-part video. In the first part, I will focus on emotional intelligence, which would be a good bridge between what we had discussed in my videos on leadership traits and leadership skills. So emotional intelligence would actually fall somewhere in between. So in any case, in this video, I will focus on emotional intelligence. And in the second part, I will discuss a couple of models, couple of theories that are uh, there that is focused primarily on leadership skills. The first skill, or rather the first set of skills that we will discuss, is emotional intelligence. I'm saying a set of skills because emotional intelligence is not one thing. It's not a unidimensional construct. Emotional intelligence is a multidimensional construct. So when we are using the term emotional intelligence, we are not talking about one skill, but four different skills actually, or four different types of abilities. Now, those skills are related to each other. That is the reason, of course, they are put under this umbrella term of emotional intelligence. But they are also distinct from each other. Those skills are also distinct from each other. In other words, it's possible that you are very high on one of those dimensions, or in other words, very competent on one of those dimensions, but not so competent in another dimension of emotional intelligence. So it's possible that those variations can happen. Now, before we delve deeper into what emotional intelligence is and what those components are, what those components of emotional intelligence are, let's analyze the term emotional intelligence, the phrase emotional intelligence. Now, although this term is now part of the popular culture, I think most of you would have heard of the term emotional intelligence. But it can be a little bit confusing, right? Because when we are talking about intelligence, we are talking about rational thinking. We are talking about logical thinking, and being able to apply that rational, logical thinking to solve problems, right? On the other hand, when we are talking about emotions, we are talking about our feelings, about moods, things that have nothing to do with rationality, or things that we typically associate with intelligence, with general intelligence. So how do these seemingly opposite terms come together? This was proposed actually by Peter Salovey, who is a professor at Yale University in the late 1980s. Most of the research on emotional intelligence started in the late 80s, early 90s, and Peter Salovey and his associates were some of the initial researchers who proposed this idea that emotions and intelligence, they are not necessarily, or emotions and rational thinking, they are not necessarily antagonistic to each other. Rather, emotions should be viewed as another set of data, like people would view numbers as data, or any information, as data. Similarly, emotions could also be viewed as data that, if processed correctly, if managed properly, would actually enhance our abilities to solve problems. So that's the basic argument that was made. And it turns out there was a lot of merit in that argument, and that's how, when Daniel Goleman wrote the book Emotional Intelligence in the, again, somewhere in the late 90s, or I'm forgetting the exact year, it became a huge bestseller. People could relate with this idea of emotional intelligence, that emotions and intelligence can work together. And the better we are at making them work together, the more effective we will be in our in solving our human problems. And a lot of our problems, of course, have to do with social interactions, right? Be it at the workplace or personal lives. So that's how the importance of the term emotional intelligence came in. Now, what is emotional intelligence, though? It's actually very simple, very straightforward. Emotional intelligence is the ability to detect emotions in self and others and manage those emotions well. That's all there is to emotional intelligence. Very simple. So how good are you at detecting emotions in self, detecting emotions in others? How good are you at managing your own emotions, and how good are you at managing other people's emotions? Those are the four components of emotional intelligence. If we describe it in form of a 2x2 matrix, when we are focused on the self, so how good am I at managing, how good am I at detecting the emotions in self? That is self-awareness. How good am I at managing those emotions? That is self-management. When it comes to others, the social component, how good am I at detecting emotions in others? And then how good am I at managing those emotions? That's is relationship management or social management. Those are the four components of emotional intelligence. Now let's delve into each of these components a little bit deeper. Let's start with self-awareness, or the first component. Now you may wonder, or you may ask, isn't everyone aware of their own emotions? Are you telling me that I don't know what emotions I'm feeling? Isn't that an insult to me? Because it's my emotions, so obviously I know what emotions I'm feeling, right? Everyone should be aware of their own emotions. So why are we making it such a big deal of being self-aware of one's own emotions? Aren't we all equally good at being aware of our own emotions? It turns out that we actually are not equally good at being aware of one's own emotions. Let me describe it this way. All cell phones can detect the signals, that we use to call or text. But some cell phones may have a very powerful antenna and will be able to detect signals even when the signals are really weak. And you may be able to then make a call using that cell phone. Whereas another cell phone, let's say it's an older cell phone or outdated cell phone, or it is a cheap cell phone that has a weak antenna, it may not be able to detect the signal when the signal is weak. Now, if you are close to a cell phone tower, of course, it will be able to detect the signal and you will be able to make your call. But it will not be able to detect the signal when you are far away from the tower, where the signal is weak, right? So that would be the analogy to discuss self-awareness. Now, when you are in a state of rage, when you are extremely angry, of course you know that you are angry. You have that self-awareness that you are angry. But are you being able to detect that anger when it is very subtle, when it is just starting to bubble up within you? Now, people may not have that level of self-awareness. And people vary in their abilities when it comes to the ability to detect emotions when they are subtle. So some may be very good at detecting emotions when they are subtle, when they are at the early stages, and some may not be as good. Some may need that, some will detect those emotions in self only when it has reached a certain intensity, right? So that's what we are talking about, self-awareness. And it matters how well are we aware of our own emotions. In fact, a lot of problems that people have in lives is because of not having enough self-awareness of one's own emotions. Uh, this may not, this example that I'm about to give may not be to do with leadership, but you will realize that many of our addictions, many of our problems that we have actually have to do with poor self-awareness. Now, you may feel a strong need to open your fridge and munch on some sweets, or take a bottle of alcohol, whatever drink. So the feeling, underlying feeling, is that, hey, you are feeling hungry, and that's the reason you are uh, opening the fridge and eating the sweets. Okay. Or that is the reason you are feeling tempted to drink alcohol. Let's say you are feeling a need for that. The real emotion may be something very different. Okay, it's possible that you had a bad day at work, or forget bad day at work, because that may give the implication that somebody made the day bad for you. Maybe you have a certain expectation from yourself, and you felt like you didn't do enough to didn't do enough work to work towards those expectations that you have for self. So you don't feel good about yourself. And when you don't feel good about yourself, that is actually the underlying emotion. It's not that you are hungry. Okay. So if you had that awareness, then probably you will not succumb to these actions of opening the fridge and going for the whatever cookie, right? So many of our, or just mindlessly watching some shows on Netflix. So it turns out that people who have greater self-awareness then will be actually be able to manage, will be able to manage their habits better. So that's the importance of self-awareness. Uh, Managing one's own emotions, of course, is related to being able to detect emotions, but there is a distinction as well, because some people may be good at detecting emotions in self, but may not be very good at managing those emotions. For example, you may know, that you are not feeling like working today. Okay. That's an emotion. You don't feel like working. You don't feel like studying today. And you know that. So you are aware of that emotion. But you are not being able to push yourself to still do the work that you need to do. So you are not being able to manage your emotions. You are succumbing to those feelings of, not being motivated, not feeling motivated. You are not being able to go against those feelings and do what you need to do your job. I don't feel like exercising today, and that's the reason I didn't do it. So you are aware of your feeling of not wanting to exercise, but you are not being able to manage that feeling well. That's the reason you skipped your physical exercise and sat on the couch. Okay, so managing one's emotions is also a important dimension, and it is distinct from self-awareness. Now, when it comes to detecting emotions in others, similarly, this people vary in their abilities when it comes to detecting emotions in others. Some people are just, they don't know. uh, you may have to literally shout at them before they realize, oh, you were angry. uh, Whereas there are others who may be able to detect your anger in you probably even before you detect it in yourself, right? So they are very perceptive of other people's emotions. Again, anger was just an example. It could be to do with any emotions. It could be to do with different positive emotions, negative emotions. A lot of problems in interpersonal relationships, romantic relationships happen because the guy, for example, may not be able to detect the emotions correctly in the other person, and vice versa. Okay, so having the ability to detect and accurately detect the emotions in others and on a timely basis is a great skill to have. And then, of course, managing those emotions too. So I may successfully detect the emotion in you that you are not feeling motivated, but do I have the skills to get you motivated, to get you inspired, right? So these are again different set of skills. So when we are talking about emotional intelligence, we are talking about these four broad categories of skills. Now, one last thing before we move forward, emotional intelligence is often described as a trait in many textbooks. Many leadership textbooks, including the North House textbook, describe or discuss emotional intelligence in the traits chapter. That is a little problematic because of many reasons, but without going into too much of complications. One point is that traits tend to be, by definition, they tend to be very stable, right? They don't change as frequently. Um, they change, but those changes are minor and happen over a really long period of time. Um, and that is the reason we have those big five personality traits that explain most of the variance in our behavior, in our pattern of thinking, feeling, and acting. Uh, when we are talking about emotional intelligence, we are talking about things that we can change. So it has more of a skill component associated with it. That's the reason I'm discussing it in context of skills. Yes, your personality traits will influence how much of self-awareness you have, how good you will be at managing your own emotions, and how much of social awareness you have, and how good you will be managing at other people's emotions. Um, so there will be temperamental differences uh, which will influence how good we will be in these different facets of emotional intelligence. But we can actually improve our skills on all of these dimensions, even if our personality traits may not change. A good way of thinking would be an introverted person will not become an extroverted person, but an introverted person can learn the skills associated with an extroverted individual. Remember introversion, extroversion. Introverted person would get tired in social interaction situations sooner than an extroverted individual, right? And an introverted individual, though, can learn certain skills of being able to interact effectively with others in social situations. So a good way of viewing emotional intelligence is in terms of skills. And we see also, if we compare it with IQ or your intellectual ability, we see that they follow different patterns. IQ tends to be very stable after you have reached your adulthood. It tends to be fairly stable for the rest of your life. If you say got a score of 120 now, it's not going to become 140 next year, or for that matter, it won't reduce to 80 unless you had some accident, brain damage. That's a different story. But mostly your IQ scores are going to stay around 120 if that test to begin with was reliable, valid test of IQ. Emotional intelligence scores, on the other hand, can change. And they do change. They do change a lot by age. The more experience we get with life, we gain greater awareness about our own selves, and we get better at managing our own emotions. We also become better at detecting emotions in others and can manage those emotions better as well. Now, this is not necessarily universally true, but we do see evidence of emotional intelligence changing, especially if we are consciously working on developing those skills of detecting emotions in self and others, and managing our own emotions and managing other people's emotions. So there is a large component, skill component here. That is why I prefer to discuss emotional intelligence more as a skill than as an ability, than as some kind of inherent ability, or for that matter, even some trait, which again tends to be very stable. I am often asked by my students how to improve emotional intelligence, how to enhance one's emotional intelligence. Although I said this is not the focus of this video or this class, but I realize this is an important question. So I will give you some tips on what you can do to enhance your capacities, your skills in these 4 dimensions of emotional intelligence. You still have to do those work yourself, but I will give you some tips. I won't be able to make you go through those various exercises. That's beyond the scope of this class, but I will give you some tips that, if you practice, will definitely enhance your emotional intelligence in these 4 dimensions. The first thing is that you have to start with enhancing your self-awareness. That is the foundation from which you have to work. If you don't have enough self-awareness of your emotions, you will not be able to manage your emotions well. And if you don't understand your own emotions, how will you be good at detecting or understanding other people's emotions. So this becomes the foundation from which you have to work. So that's where you start. So to build emotional intelligence, we have to start with self-awareness, because that is the foundation on which the other components of emotional intelligence are built. So how do you improve your self-awareness? There are many things that you can do, but one of the simplest things that you can do, which will have enormous impact, would be to schedule some time daily where you are doing nothing but sitting quietly. I'm saying schedule that time because we have lost the habit of doing nothing, of just sitting quietly. Because even if we get a minute's free time, what do most people do? They reach out for their cell phone, start looking into their messages or social media feed or whatever other feed that they follow, or playing games. So our brains are always busy. It's a lot of noise always in the brain then. So if you are constantly preoccupied with what's on the social media, or you're constantly checking things, then you are not diverting the attention to your inner self, to your own thoughts, your own feelings. And over a period of time, you become weak when it comes to diverting attention to self and detecting emotions well. So that is the reason you have to devote some time or schedule some time on a daily basis where you are consciously focusing your attention inside your thoughts. So when I'm saying doing nothing, sitting quietly, I'm not saying that read a book, even though that's a great habit. But when it comes to this exercise, you just sit quietly, stay alert to your thoughts. Where are your thoughts drifting? Each thoughts will have some associated feelings with them. And if you pay careful attention, you will notice how your emotions change as your thoughts drift from one thought to the other. So this can be a great exercise in enhancing your self-awareness abilities, your self-awareness skills. This is actually related to various meditation exercises. Now, some of you may have had some training in meditation. Most people don't have any formal training in meditation. But even if you don't, that's all right. Just practice this habit of devoting some time on a daily basis where you are not doing anything. 30 minutes twice a day would be great, but even if you can't find that much of time, you can do 5 minutes, 10 minutes, maybe several times a day, and that will make an enormous difference in enhancing your self-awareness. Journaling is also another great habit that enhances self-awareness, but where you are writing down, and preferably use pencil and paper when you are journaling, and where you're reflecting on your thoughts, your actions, your inactions. You're analyzing them. You are also maybe planning for the future. So journaling can also be a great tool. Again, there's a lot of research that has been done on journaling as well. But of course, I won't be able to devote as much time talking about everything in great detail. But if you are interested more about it, you can watch some of the videos that I have excuse me, on these topics, especially related to stress management. So the next thing is self-management, or management of one's own emotions. Of course, if you have developed strong self-awareness, it becomes easier to manage one's own emotions, right? Remember the example, it becomes difficult to manage one's anger when it is extremely strong, right? When the intensity is too high. But it will be easier to manage that anger when it is when it is subtle, when it is weak, then it will be easier to manage it. So enhancing self-awareness will also help enhance your abilities to manage your emotions better. But beyond that, especially in context of careers, in context of achieving self, a great habit would be to write down goals, to set goals and write those goals down so that you are more committed to those goals. If, again, I realize this is there is so much of detail that one needs to go through in order for you to gain value. But few things, even while goal setting, don't start out setting big goals. Start with very simple, relatively easy goals that you can easily achieve. Okay. Uh, it is important that you don't set too difficult goals. Uh, even and most people do that in excitement initially, but then they realize that they are not being able to achieve those goals, and then um, they do not persist. So start out with something very simple, easy goals, and work on those goals. Persist even when you don't feel like, persist and attain those goals. And this will actually enhance your self-efficacy with respect to persistence. When you achieve a goal, you feel good, right? So as opposed to setting too big goals and not being able to persist, not being able to achieve, and then you develop a sense of failure, that's not the right approach. So persist and monitor your progress. So you could maintain some form of diary or some form of log where you are seeing how you are working towards those goals, how much of time, let's say, you devoted to that activity, to that goal. So monitoring is very important. um, let's go to social awareness now. Similar to the self-awareness, it becomes difficult to detect other people's emotions if we are not paying attention to them, right? Many a times, even during conversations, people are thinking about something else, or they may be thinking about their work or about their games or something else. They are not fully present with the person with whom they are interacting. They may actually be looking at their cell phone while talking with somebody else. So obviously then you will not be good at detecting the emotions or noticing or perceiving the emotions that the other person is experiencing. So important, it is extremely important that you actively listen to people. Okay, that you actively pay attention to people when you are interacting with anybody. There's a difference between active listening and passive listening, but I won't go into that much of detail here. But if you are interested, you sure will be able to find details of it on the internet or in books. But the important thing is that you pay full attention with the person, to the person with whom you are interacting, consciously, and that will help you understand their emotions, detect their emotions. And so empathy training is actually putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and imagine what must they be feeling. So anyway, these are some things that you can do with respect to social awareness. And social management, of course, the entire field of leadership is about social management, right? Uh, because you are working on managing other people's emotions, trying to get them motivated to work on things when they are not feeling like doing it, right? So many things would come into play. In fact, almost all of the things that we will discuss in the leadership area or in this program or in this class is to do with social management. So there are many things that you can do. You can develop your communication skills, and by communication skills I do not just mean your verbal communication, but also your non-verbal communication. Assertive training is one more thing. So whatever it is that you are being able to express what you feel uh, without being rude, okay, uh, but still expressing your thoughts in a polite, gentle way without being rude. So there are many formal training programs that are also there about managing other people's emotions. Uh, Transformational leadership, it's about, let's say, how to inspire people. So there are a lot of leadership development exercises that you can go through as well, which will enhance your social management skills. Important thing is that you need to practice these things over and over again in order to get good at it. Uh, if you avoid people, which some people do, then obviously you will not develop these social management skills. So even if you're failing, but if you consciously approach people and try to communicate with them, uh, even if you're failing, you will over a period of time learn from your mistakes and get better at it. If you are approaching it from a conscious awareness perspective. Anyway, one last suggestion that I have that will impact uh, all these dimensions of emotional intelligence is associate yourself or spend time with people who have high emotional intelligence on all or some of these dimensions, because uh, you can learn a lot by observing people, or if you as opposed to trying to do everything yourself. So you spend sufficient amount of time with people who have high emotional intelligence, you even subconsciously, even without paying a conscious attention to the process, will develop some of those skills that they have. You know, many of those skills will start rubbing off on you. So one thing that you can do which will have a major impact would be to spend time with people, or to be friends with people, or to have mentors who have high emotional intelligence on any of these dimensions. And if you do succeed in enhancing your emotional intelligence, it will have a major impact on your life in very positive way. So there's quite a lot of research papers that have been published on emotional intelligence in the last 2 decades, and we do see that the more emotionally intelligent you are, the greater your performance, financial performance, career performance, happiness will be. You can see uh, studies showing that the top 25% performers have much higher emotional intelligence than the bottom 25% performers. So let's say, this is from a paper published in 2010 by Friedman, and we see this kind of relationship between emotional intelligence and success and also happiness. There's more stats that you can find. Um, People with high IQ make about $29,000 more annually than people with low emotional intelligence. And that's a substantial amount of money, as you can realize. Anyway, I won't spend too much time discussing all those statistical findings. Suffice it to say that emotional intelligence have a significant impact on your performance, on your success, even on your happiness. Okay, and definitely also when it comes to the role of leaders, because leadership is a social activity. It's you are dealing with people, so the greater emotional intelligence you will have, the more effective you will be when it comes to managing people. Now the question, which do you think is more important when it comes to leadership, IQ or EQ? You could pause the video and reflect on this question. And what would be your guess? Do you think IQ will have a bigger impact on the effectiveness as leaders, or do you think EQ will have a greater impact? When I ask that question, most people tend to answer EQ. Uh, so emotional intelligence will have a greater impact than intelligence. That actually is not correct. If we take the entire population, people with super high IQ to very low IQ and everyone in middle, if we talk about the entire spectrum, and we also talk about the entire spectrum of emotional intelligence, we would find a greater impact of intelligence or IQ on overall life success than emotional intelligence. But the specific impact of emotional intelligence in comparison to IQ will vary by context. What do I mean by that? If we are comparing, if we are not talking about the entire spectrum of people in the population, if we are talking about people with low IQ, of course, the ones amongst them, the ones who have more EQ or more emotional intelligence will be more successful than the ones who have less emotional intelligence. We may not see that much of a difference amongst people who have high IQ, because most of their success is being explained by IQ, or that is playing the biggest role in their success. So EQ, high or low, may not make that much of a significant difference. So you can see here that IQ then is playing a bigger role. But again, this is not always the case. Let me give another example to illustrate this. Let's take the example of, say, Harvard graduates from their MBA program. Okay. Now, all the students who entered into the Harvard MBA program will have an above average IQ level score, right? Because even if those students are not necessarily tested on IQ tests, but those entrance requirements in terms of GRE or GMAT, those exams, they are similar to IQ exams in the IQ tests, in the sense that they test your problem solving ability, your analytical ability. So in the Harvard MBA program, and these numbers are arbitrary, we may have people with IQ ranges, say, between 120 and 130. We will not have people there with IQs of 80 or 70, right? We have a much smaller band, smaller variance in the IQ scores. Now, 5 or 10 years after graduating from the MBA program, though not all of these MBA graduates will be equally successful. Some would be, extremely successful, not some others not so much. So where does that variability come from? They were all mostly equally intelligent. So the variability there would come more from emotional intelligence scores, because even though the variability in IQ was limited for those students, the variability in EQ would be much more, right? The program doesn't select based on high or low emotional intelligence scores. So there will be much greater variability in the emotional intelligence of those MBA graduates, and consequently that will have a bigger impact on who is more successful or who is more happy in one's lives versus who isn't. So the impact of emotional intelligence and intelligence can vary by context. The most important thing to remember that it can be an interesting academic question, which is having a greater impact, IQ or EQ. But from a very pragmatic perspective, it doesn't matter What we know is that IQ makes a difference. What we also know that EQ makes a difference. So we have to make use of both these variables as much as possible, right? It's not IQ versus EQ, rather IQ plus EQ. So we need to develop both, and that is ultimately what is going to help us be more successful in our lives, as well as in the different roles that we take up in our careers, including that of leadership.